In this chapter, we'll look at how taxes and subsidies impact the market. And so before, we've only allowed the government to set price ceilings and price floors, but another way that they do interact with markets is to apply taxes and subsidies. So taxes and subsidies are just another way that the government can impact the market equilibrium. In the case of taxes, this is the official definition is something along the lines of a compulsory financial contribution by a government to raise revenue. This time of year, most people are thinking about income tax, but there are other kinds of taxes as well, such as sales tax that you pay every time you buy a good. Here in South Carolina, we do have different levels of sales tax depending on whether the good is a raw food item or some type of a finished good. There's even different taxes for cars and all sorts of different things. So taxes are just basically when you pay the government money. A subsidy is the opposite of that. It's where the government pays you money. So this is financial aid supplied by the government to a specific industry. So many of you are benefiting from a subsidy, whether you know it or not. There's a lot of subsidies from the government to education, be it from having a subsidized loan where you have better terms than you would otherwise have for a loan at your current state in life. Sometimes it's just scholarships that are also subsidized by the government, where they pay a certain portion of it, not even a loan. So subsidies are when the government pays you to do something. And so we're going to be using specifically a per unit tax and subsidy, which means that it's the same amount of a tax or subsidy for each unit. So our curve shifts are going to be parallel. Now, there's nothing that this assumption does to change any of the things. It just makes our sketching a little simpler so we don't have to worry about if it shifts more for low or higher. We're just doing a straight same amount of $1 of a tax or subsidy, whether it's the first unit or the 20th unit. So we'll work through both a tax and a subsidy in a graph, but we're going to start off with taxes. And taxes can be applied to the buyers or the sellers. We're going to do the producers first. So this is a tax on making and selling a good. So now our producers are going to receive an increase in the marginal cost for producing a good, which means that our supply is going to decrease. Remember, that is an inward shift. This is another way of saying that the minimum that someone is willing to accept is going down for each unit by the amount of the tax. That's just another way of saying it. Okay. So if we have a demand and a supply curve, I know nothing about their elasticity, so I'm drawing them roughly unit, not exactly. So we start off like this. We have that our supply curve is decreasing. So decreasing is an inward shift, like this. So this is how much would be supplied when that tax, right? This is however many dollars the tax is. We can see we've got a new point of intersection, and this gives us how many are produced. But we also see that it intersects our supply and demand in different places, because now the price that a person pays is not the same as what the government or what the supplier gets to keep. So up here is the price that a consumer pays. It's on their demand curve. But down here is the price that producers actually get to keep because they have to give some of it away. So if we want to compare what's happening in our graph, we can see the price paid by consumers is going to rise because it goes from P0 to that P con. So after taxes, consumers pay higher prices, but suppliers receive lower prices. It falls specifically to what we have labeled as P producer. Our equilibrium quantity is also falling. It goes from Q0 to Q tax. Now if we wanted to shade in the revenue that the government gets, so the difference between the two supply curves, or the two prices here, is how much it gets per unit, and it gets it for all of the units that are taxed. So this rectangle here is our revenue. So the revenue for the government, I didn't leave myself enough room to write this out, so I'm going to write it over here. It's the difference between the consumer price and the producer price times the number of units in our tax. Okay. If we want to see what happens to consumer and producer surplus, we can sketch those out as well. Consumers, yellow is a little hard to see, but it's that top triangle up there. So we can see that consumer surplus, I'm not going to write in that color, has gone down. It originally went all the way down to the equilibrium. If we want to see what's happening to producer surplus, that's down here. So we can see that producer surplus is also down. Okay. So the question is, what's happening to total surplus? Well, there's a part that we haven't shaded of our original total surplus. This triangle out here. And that triangle is surplus that used to exist, but no longer does because of this tax. And that causes what we call a dead weight loss. A dead weight loss discourages consumption and production of the tax good. So it discourages people to produce and sell that item, and therefore there's going to be fewer mutually beneficial trades that are not going to happen because the tax is imposed. So there are places where the cost to produce are actually lower if you ignore the tax than the willingness to pay. So people would trade, but they don't because the tax artificially increases the costs. So this is where the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost if there was no tax. Right? That's all these units here. So do note though that we are not going to worry about this part of the tax revenue because it doesn't go away. So we don't worry about the tax revenue. It is just a transfer from consumers and producers in whatever market this is to consumers and producers in the subsidized industry. Oh, sorry, from them in this industry to taxpayers. specifically from this industry to the generalized public. One other thing we should discuss, so we said consumer and producer surplus goes down, and since total surplus is those together, it is certainly falling as well. But we also need to add something called total welfare to society. So is society better or worse off? This is different from total surplus. Total surplus is only for people in the market, total gains from trade in that market. Welfare to society is including the fact that there may be some alternative things happening outside of the market because of what's happening in the market. And here, because of the tax, it's shifting things away from this market resources into other ones where they are actually going to be less efficiently used, and therefore society is worse off because of this deadweight loss. So anytime you see a deadweight loss, that means society as a whole, not just the ones in this market, are going to be worse off. If instead we were to apply this tax to consumers, that means now the person buying the good is going to pay more for it, so they receive less of a benefit for buying the good than they did before. This means that the demand is going to decrease in a parallel shift because the maximum willingness to pay for each unit falls by the same amount as the per unit tax amount. So I'll do a quick sketch, but I encourage you to go back and see if you can find all the parts from the last one. So if we have supply and demand, and it starts off here, and it goes to there, and we have that demand is decreasing parallel. So demand with the tax looks something like that. So we see again a lower quantity. And I will go ahead and talk about which prices you would find. And so again, this top one up here is on the demand curve. And so that is going to be the consumer price. And down here is on the supply curve. So the main difference between this graph and the other one is what the observed market price would be. So if you encounter a question that talks about what happens to the market price, that's going to be looking at the demand curve. So here, this is the market price because that's where you have two curves. In the previous one, this top point, the consumer price, was where you had two curves. So that would be the market price in that graph. So keep looking for the other ones. I'll also go ahead and point out that again, you're going to have a deadweight loss here because people are willing to pay up there and it costs down here. And so there is a place for these mutually beneficial exchanges that's not happening. So there is some kind of a deadweight loss. So for subsidies, this is where the government pays you money. And so we're going to look at if we were to apply it to consumers. Okay. So now you're getting an extra benefit for buying a good that you did not get before. So this is going to make demand increase, right? When the government pays you to do something, there's a higher desire to do something. And so this means the max willingness to pay for each unit goes up by the same amount as the per unit subsidy. So if we were to draw our starting demand and supply, label our starting point, and then we're going to have an increase in demand with the subsidy, so it shifts out like this. So with the subsidy, we see a higher quantity. That shouldn't be a surprise. Again, we have it intersecting at two places. So this top dot, top blue dot, is only on the supply curve. So that is the producer price. And then the consumer price, that's on the old demand curve down there, is the lower one. And for this one, if it was talking about a market price, that's with the two places. So the market price is the producer price in this graph. Okay, let's look at how things are changing in our picture. So first, the price received by producers is going up. So it rises, specifically from P0 to P prod, because now the government is paying some of the price, and so a higher price gets paid. But the price paid by consumers is falling, because while producers are getting more for their product, the government is paying part of it. So that goes from P0 to P con. The equilibrium quantity is also rising because it's going from the original amount to the higher subsidized amount, because when you pay people to do stuff, they do more of it. The cost of the subsidy is how much is paid per unit, which is shown by the difference between the price consumers pay and the price producers get, times the number of units. So it is this purple rectangle here, or the difference between P prod and P con times the subsidy quantity, or the per unit subsidy amount times the subsidy quantity. Either way would get it for you. And then there is a deadweight loss here as well. So because all of these cost more to produce, as shown by the area under the supply curve, than you would get for selling, or than they are worth to people, it causes a deadweight loss. So this is because it encourages consumption of the subsidized good. And how much the marginal costs outweigh the marginal benefit. And because those are not the same, because the supply curve is above the demand curve at those units, that's what gives us that dead weight loss. So we should point out our other things. So our consumer surplus is now this yellow rectangle, which is bigger than the old one. So consumer surplus rises. Producer surplus is this one, which it used to stop at P0 as well. So producer surplus rises. So if both of those are going up, that means together total surplus must be rising. So people in this market are really happy. However, we have a deadweight loss. And because there's a deadweight loss, that means there is a loss to society. So there is some type of welfare loss. So society is worse off. And that's because there's a deadweight loss. So anytime you see a deadweight loss, even though the people in the market are really happy because there's a bunch of this good and they're getting to sell it for more money and they're going to pay less to get it, so they're all really happy. But society is worse off because it's allowing more resources to be put into whatever this market is than is efficient, because the cost, they're going to a place where the marginal cost is outweighing the marginal benefit, so they're doing too much. And because resources are going here, they can't be going somewhere else. This is scarcity coming back into play. So even though people in the market are happy, society as a whole is not better off than they used to be. And that's because of the deadweight loss. We're not worried about this whole subsidy amount, that purple rectangle being thrown in, because the part that we call the subsidy is just part of the subsidy called the cost. It is just a transfer from taxpayers to the people in the market. So this is just a money transfer, and because of that, we don't worry about the purple rectangle that is the cost of the subsidy, right? It's not a problem. The problem comes from the fact that there's a dead weight loss and it's putting way too many resources into this market. Now instead, let's suppose that our subsidy is placed on the producers. So this means essentially they receive a decrease in the marginal cost for producing the good than they did before, because the government is paying them part of the money to do the production, and therefore it makes their cost for each unit they produce lower by however much the subsidy is. So this would make the supply curve increase. It shouldn't be a surprise if the government pays people to do something, they want to do more of it. Makes sense. This also means that the minimum willingness to accept for each unit falls by the same amount as the per unit subsidy. So I'll let you take some time to try and sketch out the picture, but I'll at least get you started. So if we have some demand and supply, our starting picture looks like this, as it usually does. And then here we're going to add a subsidy to suppliers. So we want supply to increase, which is an outward shift. So we see that happening. We see that our quantity produced goes up, right? Anytime you're drawing supply and demand to make sure you get the shifts backwards, think about what's going on. Here, our supply is increasing, so we expect to make more of a product. And we can see that indeed we do, the quantity rises. So we shifted our supply in the right direction. Okay. And then to get the two different prices, this top dot here is only on the supply curve, so that's the producer price, and leaving this one to be consumers. So just like in the previous picture, because a subsidy is paying some part of the price to producers that consumers don't have to, either directly or indirectly, that means the price producers get should be higher than the price consumers get. So the producer price will be on top and the consumers on the bottom. Now, the main difference between this picture and the previous picture is the fact of where the market price is. So the observed price, or the market price, in this case is going to be down here because that's the one that has two curves. So to get the market price, or what you would see on the price tag, whether it would change or not, that is going to be based on where both of the curves are. So that's this bottom consumer price in this picture. And so from there, you should be able to see what happens. It's going to be very similar results at this point to what happened when we applied our subsidy to consumers. So now that we've talked about how to graph a tax or a subsidy, the real question is, who is going to pay more of the tax or the subsidy, the producer or the consumer? And the answer to this depends on the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. Because the more elastic one is going to be impacted differently than the more inelastic one. So specifically, if demanders are more elastic than suppliers, that means they have a flatter demand curve. Right? So if we're talking demanders are more elastic, they have something like this, and supply is a lot steeper. So because demand is more elastic, that means they have better substitutes. So better options. So this is something they could easily switch to another item or something like that. And since they can move to a different market, they're going to have to pay less of a tax. However, because they also can move to another market, they're not a captive audience, that means demanders get less of the subsidy. So the more elastic one in this case is demand, and therefore they don't have to stick around in the market when it's taxed, and so they can leave the market instead and therefore have a lower tax burden. However, also because they're not as captive of an audience, they also could leave in the case of a subsidy or find other alternatives so they don't get as much of a subsidy as well. Whereas if suppliers are the more elastic one, then that means that the suppliers have better alternatives. Right, so they could switch to producing another product or something like that. So in this case, the demand is steep, but the supply is flat. And since the supply is flat, if a tax comes in the market, they can just start producing in a different market if the tax is too high. So they pay less. But they also get less of a subsidy. In the next slide, we'll draw through some more specific pictures so you can get a better idea of what's going on. So for this one, we're going to split our graphs into two categories. The ones on this side will be where demand is more elastic. And the ones on this side will be where supply is more elastic. And then we'll graph both a tax and a subsidy for both. Just to keep everything consistent, I'm going to put all of these on demanders. So the demand curve is the one we're going to shift. So if demand is the more elastic one, that means we need a flat demand curve and a steep supply curve. And here, a flat demand curve and a steep supply curve. Okay. I'm not sure those are going to be exaggerated enough. Let's try those again. So we want a flat demand and a steep supply. Flat demand. There we go. Now we want the opposite over here. We want a very flat supply and a steep demand, flat supply and a steep demand. Okay, we've got our graphs started off. So here in this first one, we're going to tax demanders. Okay, so if we're taxing demanders, that means the demand is going to decrease by the amount there. Get rid of that old D. Okay. So here's our new one. Here we can see the quantity after the tax. And again, we have two different prices here. Up here is the consumer price. Down here is the price producers get to keep. And if we compare, I'm going to put the consumer's burden here in purple. And notice that they have a much smaller part, right? They only have a little price increase, whereas the producers have a much larger price decrease. So I'm just showing the change from that original P0, right? It's the breaking point here in the middle. How much it goes up in this case is what consumers see in a price increase, and how much it goes down is what producers get. So here we can see that that consumer box is very much smaller. So here consumers get, or not get, sorry, here it's a tax, excuse me. They pay less of our tax. Now let's see what happens if instead we were to look at a subsidy. So subsidy would make our demand curve increase like this. Our initial equilibrium was here. Our new equilibrium is here. And we'll need to look at both of those points. So that bottom point is only on the demand curve. so that is the consumer price, and that top point is on the supply curve, so that is the producer price. So the consumers see this much of a decrease in price, while producers see this much of an increase. So producers get the blue part, consumers get the purple part, and therefore, again, the consumers have a lower part. So consumers get less of the subsidy. Now let's switch to where supply is going to be the more elastic one. We're still going to let the tax and subsidy go to demand, just to keep things as much the same from our two cases as possible. And so for a tax, demand is going to decrease. I attempted to make that as same as possible. So this is the amount after the tax, but we needed to label our initials. Sorry about that. Okay, so there's our price and quantity. And we'll need to trace that up here and there. So again, we have 2 points. This top red dot is only on the demand curve, so that must be the consumer price. And this bottom one is only on the supply curve, so that must be the producer price. Okay. So that means the part that goes to consumers is the difference between the price they get have to pay after the tax versus what they were paying before, which is shown by P0. So this purple part is the loss to consumers from this price change, right? So how much they pay. And then for producers, their tax burden is just how much they lose in their price there. So we can see that the consumers here have the bigger burden. So here, producers pay less of the tax. Okay. And then going to our last picture down here. Right. We are still subsidizing, so we're still having an increase, attempting to make it the same vertical shift as well. So here's our quantity, oops, not tax, excuse me. This is a subsidy. Oh, small problem. I need my demand curve to intersect. So down here, our price is practically 0, but it's not quite. And there's our other price. This bottom one is on the demand curve, so this is the consumer price, and this is the producers. In general, when you have a tax, consumers pay more than producers get, so the consumer price will be on the top, and the producer price will be the lower one. You see that with both of our top pictures here. And then in the bottom, where we have subsidies, that is where the government's paying part of the price, so producers get more for a product than consumers even pay for it. So we expect the producer price to be above the consumer price. Okay, so let's figure out what's going on. So for consumers, they see originally they were paying this price, but now they're paying down here. So their sort of amount of cash they get from the subsidy is that purple amount, whereas producers get this decrease here. And so again, we have the case where producers get less of a subsidy. So if you compare the two, you can see what's going on in the fact that whichever one, demand or supply, is more elastic, they will have a smaller tax burden and also a smaller share of the subsidy. So the more inelastic one, the one who has to stick around in the market because they don't have alternatives, that's what it means to be inelastic, they're the ones that have to pay the brunt of the tax, as well as the ones that have to that get more of the subsidy. It does not matter whether the legislation is put to where it's on the demanders or the suppliers. This will be the case either way. So it doesn't matter if the tax is written to be put on demanders or consumers or producers. There we go. What really matters is their elasticities. So does not matter who it's put on. What matters is who's more inelastic or elastic.